We're going to briefly review multiplication and division using positive and negative numbers, and we'll also take a quick look at how this would work if we were using fractions rather than whole numbers. When you multiply any positive number by another positive number, the result will always be positive. Similarly, if you multiply a negative number by a negative number, the result will always be positive. Multiplying a negative times a negative is like using double negatives in conversation. If I said I'm not going to the store, the two nots cancel each other out, so it would mean I am going to the store. The same thing happens with numbers. A negative times another negative cancels the negatives out. Any two negatives will cancel out. However, if you multiply a positive by a negative or a negative by a positive, your result will be negative. So essentially, when the signs match, positive times positive or negative times negative, the result will be positive. But when the signs are mismatched, positive times a negative or negative times a positive, your result will be a negative. Let's try a few examples. Notice that my numbers have brackets around them. This is helpful when we're working with signed numbers so that we can distinguish a sign, like negative in front of a 4, from an operation, like a minus sign that would appear outside of a bracket. Let's look at the first one. 2 times 4. We have a positive times a positive, so our result is going to be a positive number. 2 times 4 is 8, and because they're both positive, my result will be positive. Our next one is negative 2 times negative 4. I know 2 times 4 is 8, but because I have those two negative signs, I have to consider them. Remember, two negatives cancel each other out, so this is still going to be a positive 8. Try the next one. We've got negative 2 times 4. I know 2 times 4 is going to be 8, so let me look now at whether I have two different signs or the same sign. I've got a negative and an absence of a negative, which means a positive. So that means that my number is going to be a negative. Remember, a negative times a positive is going to be a negative. Same is true for the next one. 2 times 4 is 8, but because we have one negative sign, that's going to be a negative. Now let's take a look at these two in red at the bottom. They're a bit more difficult. We've got 0 times 4 and then 0 times negative 4. 0 is not a signed number. In the first case, we have a non-signed number times a positive number, so the result is simply going to be 0. The reason is because any number times 0 is always going to be 0. Then if we look at the next one, we've got 0 times negative 4. Well, the negative sign is negated here. That means it's not relevant because any number times 0 is going to be 0, and 0 can't be a signed number, so our result again is going to be 0. Remember, zeros have their own rule, and that's going to supersede us having to look at the positives or the negatives. Any number, whether it's positive or negative, times a 0 is going to be 0. So we don't want to get fooled by this one at the bottom here. We've got a 0 times a negative. That negative is not relevant here because our result is going to be 0 no matter what in this case. Let's take a look at that next line. I've got a positive times a negative, so I know my result is going to be negative. 10 times 10, 100. So I've got negative 100. Here I have a positive times a positive. I know my result is going to be positive, and 8 times 5 is 40. I've got 6 times negative 3. I know my result is going to be negative. 6 times 3 is 18, so my result is negative 18. Negative 3 times negative 11. I've got two negatives. Those are going to cancel each other out, so I have a positive result. 3 times 11 is 33. I've got negative 1 times negative 1. Those negatives are going to cancel out. I get 1 times 1, which equals just 1. My last one here, I have a positive times a negative, so I know my result is going to be negative. I've got 25 times negative 4, so it's going to be a negative 100. Pause and take a look at the pattern of results here to help you clarify the rule. Now let's step it up a notch by looking at multiplications of 3 numbers in a row. Pause here and try to figure out if each of these answers is going to be positive or negative. And then on your own notes, put the sign in. Then we'll do the multiplication to find what the number is. Let's look at our signs. I'm going to put positive signs in to mark that we know a result is going to be a positive number, just so you know that we've gone through each of these and we haven't skipped any. If I look at my first string of numbers, 2 times 4 times 10, they're all positive, so I know my result is going to be some kind of positive number. The next one is negative 2 times negative 4 times negative 10. I've got 2 negatives, those are going to cancel out. Then a third negative. That doesn't have another negative canceling it out, so this result is going to be negative. Remember, every two negatives cancel each other out. When we have an odd number of negatives, then, we're going to end up with a negative result when we multiply. Let's take a look at the next one. Negative 2 times 4 times 10. I've only got one negative. When I have an odd number of negatives, like when I had 3 above or 1 here, I know my result is going to be negative. The next one, 2 times negative 4 times negative 10. I've got two negatives. They're going to cancel each other out. I'm multiplying that result by a positive number, so my result is going to be positive. If I have an even number of negatives and I'm multiplying numbers across, I'm going to get a positive result. Our next, 0 times 4 times negative 2. Notice this one's in red again. We've got multiplication times a 0. So I know that my result, no matter what, is going to be 0, so I'm going to leave no sign here. For the next string, I also have a 0 in that multiplication set, so I know my result is going to be 0. And remember, 0 is not a signed number, so I'm not going to put signs down in these spaces. Let's try the next row. 10 times negative 10 times 2. I've got one negative. Because it's an odd number of negatives, I'm going to have a negative result. The next one, I have one negative, 8 times 5 times negative 2, so my result will be negative. Next, 6 times negative 3 times negative 1. I have two negatives, those are going to cancel out, multiplied by a positive, so I'm going to get a positive result. Negative 3 times negative 11 times negative 1. Every two negatives cancel out. I'm going to have a positive number then, but that's going to be multiplied by a negative. So I'm going to have a negative result. Notice here I have an odd number of negative numbers being multiplied, so again my result will be negative. Next, negative 1 times negative 1 times 5. I've got two negatives and one positive. The two negatives cancel each other out, making a positive. Multiply that by a positive, our result will be positive. We had an even number of negatives. And the last one, 25 times negative 1 times negative 2. Again, we have an odd number of negative signs. They're going to cancel each other out, and my result will be positive. Now that we've done the signs, pause here and try to find what the numeric results are for each of these that go with the signs. Check your work. The results in order are positive 80, negative 80, negative 80, positive 80, 0, 0, negative 200, negative 80, positive 18, negative 33, positive 5, and positive 200. Remember that with positive numbers, we don't need to show the sign, so I can remove all the positive signs from my positive results and my answers are still correct. Now let's try it with fractions. The same rules about every two negatives canceling each other out will apply. So if we have an even number of negatives, we're going to have a positive result. If we have an odd number of negatives, we're going to have a negative result. So let's start by filling in whether we think our answers will be positive or negative. Our questions are 1 over 2 times 1 over 2, negative 1 over 2 times 1 over 2, 1 over 2 times 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2, 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2, 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2 times 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2, and finally 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2 times negative 1 over 2. Write whether each result will be positive or negative by giving the positive or negative sign. Then we'll find what the numeric value of the result is. You should have the results will be positive, negative, negative, positive, positive, and negative in that order. Notice in the first one, we only have positive numbers, so the result will be positive. In the second one, we have an odd number of negatives, so the result will be negative, and we use that same pattern throughout. In the third example, there's one negative, so it's going to be negative. The next one, two negatives, so it's going to be positive. Next, we have two negatives, again, it'll be positive, and in the last one, three negatives, so the result will be positive. And now find the numeric value. In case it's been a while since you did any multiplication with fractions, let me quickly review. When you're multiplying fractions together, you multiply the numerators across the top and then the denominators along the bottom. So if I was multiplying 1 over 2 times 1 over 2, I would rewrite that as 1 times 1 over 2 times 2, which is equal to 1 over 4. If I had a third 1 over 2 that I wanted to multiply, so I had 1 over 2 times 1 over 2 times 1 over 2. I would just replicate the same steps. That would be numerators across 1 times 1 times 1 over the denominators written across 2 times 2 times 2. Okay, then my numerator 1 times 1 times 1 is 1, and my denominator becomes 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. So my result would be 1/8. I'm going to move those two examples up to the corner so you can refer to them if you find them helpful. Now let's take a look at our results. Try finding the numeric result for each of these problems we already started where we filled in the sign. Once you've got your answers, hit play so that you can check your work. Here are my results in order. I had positive 1/4, then a negative 1/4, then a negative 1/8, then a positive 1/8, then a positive 1/16, then a negative 1/16. And again, because we don't have to put a sign in front of positive numbers, if I remove the positives from the 3 positive results here, my answers are still correct. If it's a negative number, your result that is negative, you need to retain that negative sign, otherwise your answer is incorrect. Let's now take a look at division. The same rules are going to apply here. If we divide a positive by a positive, our result is positive. A negative divided by a negative will also be positive. Positive divided by a negative, or a negative divided by a positive, however, will give us a negative result. Notice here that we're only looking at 2 numbers at a time, typically in division. But if we have an even number of negatives, they're going to cancel each other out and we'll get a positive result, just like we saw in multiplication. But if we have an odd number of negatives, in this case 1 on the denominator or 1 on the numerator, then our result will be negative. Take a look at the practice problems to the side and then decide whether each one of these is going to have a positive or negative result. Then we'll deal with finding the numeric value. We start with negative 10 divided by 2. We have 1 negative, so the result will be negative. We then have negative 10 divided by negative 2. 2 negatives cancel out. We'll have a positive result. Then 10 divided by negative 2. 1 negative, so we'll have a negative result. Then negative 1 divided by 2. That'll give us also a negative result. Negative 1 divided by negative 2 is going to give us a positive result because the 2 negatives cancel out. And we've got 5 divided by negative 2, so our result will be negative. Now pause and try to find the numeric values that go with the signs we've indicated. The answers in order are negative 5, positive 5, negative 5, negative 1/2, positive 1/2, and negative 2.5 or 2.5. Again, for the positive answers, we can remove the positive sign without affecting them. But for any negative answers, the negative sign must be there for the answer to be correct. Let's try one last practice. For each of these, pretend that whatever numbers we put in here, that they have the sign indicated, negative or positive. Take a look at whether we have multiplication or division here, and guess whether the answer would be positive or negative if we were to put numbers in along with each of these signs. Here are the answers. The first one we have identified 4 negative numbers being multiplied by each other. Because it's an even number of negatives, the result will be positive. In the next one, we have 5 numbers being multiplied together, 3 of which are positive and 2 of which are negative. Remember, 2 negatives cancel each other out. We've got an even number of negatives here, so the result will be positive. In the next one, we have 2 positives multiplied by 3 negatives. That's an odd number of negatives, so our result is going to be negative. Now let's look at the division. We have a negative divided by a positive. That's going to give us a negative result. We then have a negative divided by a negative, which will give us a positive result. A positive divided by a positive will also give us a positive result. And then we have a positive divided by a negative, which again will give us a negative result.